By late 1944, Germany's once mighty Luftwaffe was bleeding to death in the skies over Europe. Allied bombers darkened German cities while Mustangs and Spitfires ruled the air. But in the shadows of Kurt Tank's drawing board, a monster was taking shape. The Focke-Wulf Ta 152. A fighter so advanced, so devastatingly powerful, that on paper it could challenge anything the Allies had. Yet this machine would become a symbol not of German engineering triumph, but of desperate overreach in a war already lost. The Ta 152's story begins in 1943, when Focke-Wulf's chief designer Kurt Tank realized that his legendary FW-190 had reached its evolutionary limit. While the Butcherbird dominated at low altitude, it gasped for breath above 20,000 feet, precisely where American bombers cruised with their Mustang escorts. Tank's solution was radical: stretch the FW-190's fuselage, bolt on longer wings, and crown it with the most powerful engine Germany could build. But this wasn't just another variant, it was a complete reimagining. The Ta 152 would be Germany's first true high-altitude interceptor, designed to climb into the stratosphere and strike down bombers that seemed untouchable. Tank's design philosophy was elegant in its brutality: maximum performance at any cost. The aircraft would sacrifice everything: fuel economy, ease of production, pilot comfort, for raw speed and climb rate. In Tank's vision, a handful of TR-152s could tear through bomber formations like wolves among sheep. The project received the highest priority designation from the Reich Air Ministry. Resources poured in, prototypes were rushed through testing, and production lines were hastily established. But even as the first airframes took shape, the clock was ticking. Every month of development meant more German cities in ruins, more experienced pilots lost, and more Allied fighters patrolling German skies. By early 1944, the first prototypes soared into the sky above Langenhagen airfield. Watching from the ground, Kurt Tank must have felt both pride and dread. His creation was magnificent, but was it already too late? What Tank had created was nothing short of extraordinary. At the heart of the Ta 152 roared the Junkers Jumo 213E1, a 12-cylinder liquid-cooled monster producing 1,750 horsepower with methanol water injection. This engine didn't just power the aircraft, it transformed it into something approaching science fiction. The numbers were staggering. The Ta 152H could reach 472 miles per hour at 41,000 feet, altitudes where most fighters struggled to even function. It could climb to 30,000 feet in under 15 minutes, ascending like an elevator into the stratosphere where American bombers thought they were safe. With its pressurized cockpit and sophisticated oxygen system, the TR-152 could fight effectively at altitudes that would leave other pilots gasping and blacking out. But speed was only part of the equation. Tank armed his creation with devastating firepower, a single 30mm Mk108 cannon firing through the propeller hub, supplemented by two 20mm MG151 cannons in the wing roots. A single burst from that 30mm cannon could tear the wing off a B-17, while the 20mm rounds could shred fighter aircraft like paper. The aircraft's range was equally impressive. Over 750 miles on internal fuel, with provision for drop tanks that could extend its reach even further. This wasn't just an interceptor, it was a strategic weapon capable of striking deep into Allied-controlled airspace. Most remarkably, the Ta 152 retained the docile handling characteristics that made the FW-190 beloved by pilots. Despite its size and power, it remained controllable and forgiving, a thoroughbred racehorse that wouldn't buck its rider. On paper, Kurt Tank had created the perfect fighter for Germany's desperate situation. But in war, paper specifications mean nothing without the infrastructure to support them. The The Ta-152's path from drawing board to operational status was fraught with obstacles that would have destroyed a lesser project. Germany's industrial infrastructure, hammered by years of Allied bombing, struggled to produce the sophisticated components the aircraft demanded. The Jumo 213 engine, magnificent as it was, required precision manufacturing and exotic materials that were increasingly scarce. Each engine needed specialized alloys, precision-machined components, and careful assembly by skilled technicians, resources Germany could barely spare. Quality control became a nightmare as bombed factories relocated underground, where working conditions were abysmal and experienced workers were drafted into the Wehrmacht. Testing revealed more problems. The aircraft's sophisticated systems, pressurization, fuel injection, high-altitude oxygen delivery, were prone to failure in the field. The methanol water injection system that gave the engine its incredible power was temperamental and corrosive, eating through seals and corroding fuel lines. Pilots reported constant mechanical failures, forcing emergency landings that often proved more dangerous than combat itself. Weather testing exposed another critical flaw. The TR-152's performance degraded dramatically in the cold, wet conditions typical of northern European winters. Ice formation on the supercharger intake could cause catastrophic engine failure, while the aircraft's electrical systems proved vulnerable to moisture. These weren't minor teething problems. They were fundamental design limitations that couldn't be easily fixed. Perhaps most critically, the compressed development timeline meant that normal testing procedures were abandoned. Aircraft were rushed from prototype to production without the months of evaluation that would normally identify and fix these issues. Each aircraft that rolled off the production line was essentially a test vehicle, with pilots serving as unwilling test subjects. By late 1944, it was clear that the Ta-152 needed at least another year of development to reach operational reliability, time that Germany simply didn't have. When the first operational Ta-152s finally reached combat units in January 1945, they entered a war that bore little resemblance to the conflict Kurt Tank had envisioned 2 years earlier. Only about 43 aircraft were ever delivered to frontline squadrons, a pitiful number compared to the thousands of Mustangs and Spitfires now patrolling German airspace. The aircraft were distributed to elite units like JG-301, whose pilots were among the Luftwaffe's last experienced veterans. These men, exhausted by years of combat and flying on synthetic fuel that barely kept their engines running, found themselves handed the keys to Germany's most sophisticated fighter. The irony was bitter, the perfect weapon arriving in the hands of a broken air force. Initial pilot impressions were mixed, but generally positive. Oberst Gerhard Barkhorn, one of the Luftwaffe's top aces, praised the Ta-152's climb rate and high-altitude performance, noting that it was the first German fighter that could effectively engage Allied aircraft at their preferred altitudes. Other pilots marveled at the aircraft's speed and firepower, describing successful intercepts of P-51 Mustangs that had previously seemed untouchable, but for every success story, there were multiple failures. Aircraft broke down on the flight line, engines seized during takeoff, and mechanical problems forced pilots to abort missions before they could engage the enemy. Of the 43 aircraft delivered, fewer than half were operational at any given time. The few combat encounters that did occur showed both the aircraft's potential and the futility of Germany's situation. Individual Ta-152 pilots scored kills against Allied fighters, proving that the aircraft's performance advantages were real. But these isolated victories were meaningless against the hundreds of Allied aircraft that darkened German skies daily. Most tragically, several Ta-152s were destroyed by their own side. German anti-aircraft gunners, unfamiliar with the aircraft's distinctive silhouette, shot down their own pilots returning from missions. Beyond its technical issues, the Ta-152 faced logistical challenges that made effective operations nearly impossible. The aircraft's sophisticated systems demanded high-octane aviation fuel that Germany could barely produce, exotic lubricants that were in critically short supply, and spare parts manufactured in factories that were being bombed around the clock. Each Ta-152 required approximately 20 hours of maintenance for every hour of flight time, a ratio that made sustained operations impossible with Germany's shrinking pool of trained ground crews. Many aircraft sat idle not because of battle damage, but because mechanics lacked the parts or expertise to maintain them properly. The fuel situation was particularly desperate. The Ta-152's powerful engine consumed fuel at a prodigious rate, burning through precious aviation gasoline that was needed by hundreds of other aircraft. By early 1945, some Ta-152s were grounded not by mechanical failure, but simply because there was no fuel to put in their tanks. Pilot training presented another insurmountable challenge. The Ta-152's sophisticated systems and high-performance characteristics demanded extensive training that Germany's decimated flight schools could no longer provide. New pilots, rushed through abbreviated training programs on synthetic fuel in obsolete trainers, were expected to master one of the world's most advanced fighters with minimal instruction. The aircraft's very sophistication became a liability. Unlike the simple, robust fighters of earlier in the war, the Ta-152 required pilots who understood complex engine management, high-altitude physiology, and sophisticated weapons systems. Such pilots were rare in 1945, and getting rarer with each passing day. Most damaging of all was the psychological impact on German pilots. The Ta-152 represented everything Germany could no longer sustain: cutting-edge technology, precision manufacturing, abundant resources, and time for proper development. Flying it was a constant reminder of what might have been had the war gone differently. Allied intelligence agencies quickly recognized the threat posed by the Ta-152, even as German pilots struggled with its operational challenges. British and American technical intelligence units captured detailed performance data through radar tracking, pilot debriefings, and eventually examination of captured aircraft. What they found was sobering. The Ta-152's performance envelope exceeded that of any Allied fighter in service, particularly at high altitude. At 40,000 feet, where B-29s would later operate against Japan, the German fighter could outclimb and outrun anything the Allies possessed. Intelligence reports warned that if Germany could produce the aircraft in significant numbers with reliable engines, it could fundamentally alter the strategic bombing campaign. Allied response was swift and multifaceted. P-51D Mustangs were fitted with improved high-altitude engines and water injection systems to partially close the performance gap. RAF Spitfire 14 and 18 variants received priority deployment to areas where Ta-152s were reported operating. More importantly, Allied pilots received specific tactical guidance on how to engage the German superfighter. The key was to avoid the Ta-152's strengths and exploit its weaknesses. Allied pilots were instructed to force combat at low altitude, where the German fighter's performance advantages disappeared. They learned to attack during takeoff and landing, when the sophisticated aircraft was most vulnerable. Most effectively, they targeted the airfields and fuel depots that the Ta-152s depended upon. American bomber crews received new tactics specifically designed to counter the Ta-152 threat. Fighter escorts stayed closer to the bombers at high altitude, and new formation tactics were developed to provide overlapping defensive fire against high-speed attackers. But perhaps the most telling Allied response was strategic. They recognized that the Ta-152 was a symptom of Germany's desperation rather than a sign of renewed strength. Intelligence analysts noted that an air force reduced to deploying 43 aircraft of a new type was no longer a strategic threat, regardless of individual aircraft performance. The Ta-152's fate was sealed not by any single flaw, but by the inexorable mathematics of industrial warfare. By 1945, Germany was attempting to deploy a 1950s fighter with 1943 infrastructure, 1942 resources, and 1941 pilot training standards. The contradiction was unsustainable. Consider the numbers. While Germany struggled to build 43 TR-152s, American factories were producing over 1,000 P-51 Mustangs per month. Each German superfighter faced odds of 20 to 1 or worse, and those odds worsened daily. No amount of individual aircraft superiority could overcome such numerical disadvantage. The industrial situation was even more damning. Each Ta-152 required exotic materials and precision manufacturing that tied up resources needed for hundreds of simpler fighters. The man-hours spent building one Ta-152 could have produced 3 Messerschmitt Bf-109s. Aircraft that, while inferior individually, could at least be fielded in meaningful numbers. Fuel logistics made the situation hopeless. Germany's synthetic fuel production was collapsing under Allied bombing, yet each Ta-152 consumed twice as much fuel as conventional fighters. The aircraft designed to defend German fuel supplies was helping to exhaust them. Most fundamentally, the TR-152 represented Germany's fatal obsession with technological solutions to strategic problems. Unable to match Allied production capacity, German planners repeatedly bet on wonder weapons that would somehow reverse the war's momentum through technological superiority alone. But war is ultimately about logistics, training, and numbers, areas where Germany was comprehensively outmatched. The Ta-152 wasn't just too little, too late. It was the wrong solution entirely. Germany needed hundreds of simple, reliable fighters and thousands of trained pilots. Instead, they built a handful of technological marvels that consumed irreplaceable resources while providing negligible strategic impact. The Ta-152 was a perfect fighter that arrived at the worst possible time. It shows us that in war, sometimes the good enough weapon in large numbers beats the perfect weapon that comes too late. If you enjoyed this story, hit subscribe and let us know what other aircraft you'd like us to cover. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.